Hello, everybody. This is Sarah Colata with Architecture Talk Tongue. Today I have a guest, Akheel Kahn, who basically is going to talk a little bit about the work that he's doing in the field of VR and emerging technologies. And we're going to talk a little bit about architecture and the industry. And I'm really excited to have you on the show, Akheel. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet me today. And do you want to talk a little bit more about yourself so that the audience knows a little bit more and the projects that you're involved with?
Sure, Sarah, I will do that. Thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate the time you've taken to have this interview. So I'm Akheel. I'm Akheel. I'm an architectural designer, architectural writer, architectural lecturer, and researcher. So there's quite a few architectural things that I am. But I am currently focused on developing qualifications or new qualifications in architecture. Emerging technologies is one of the things I'm looking at. So as Sarah had mentioned, I'm looking at things that could potentially reinvent the field, or at least not reinvent, but reintroduce the field. So I run an organization called An Architect, and through An Architect, I am currently having a series on it called The Future of Architecture, which is providing some insight into the work that I'm doing. I also work or I lecture at an institute called CAD for All, Institute of Applied Architecture, and I run a lot of experiments through this institute, under which I lead the team in designing these new programs.
Excellent. So interesting. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the future of architecture. It's a project, obviously, which you started. Can you tell me a little bit about the intention behind it and why were you so interested to sort of look deeper into this topic?
So, Sarah, I don't know how much you know about South Africa and South African socioeconomics, but if you do know anything about South Africa, you'd know that it's emerged from apartheid. It's in a post-apartheid phase. It's about 27 years into the post-apartheid phase. And there are a lot of social and political issues that have arisen from that. One of the things that it has left the industry in, if I can say in that way, is some sort of unequal place that it stands in terms of its economic potential. And there's a number of other issues related to it, but currently in South Africa, the architect, although there's a large scope of work, as you can imagine, in a developing nation, you can say that the economic prospect isn't that great. And now I know architecture is notorious around the world for not necessarily being amongst the highest of earners, but you would think in a developing country it should be. So if you're just looking at that context, the future of architecture can be seen as something, it can be seen as a tool to really accelerate infrastructural growth, especially in a developing nation. So looking at the research that I'm focused on and why it's geared towards the future of architecture, because it's really to position an architect into the future, into one of the nations that is upcoming. So if you're looking at South Africa, if you're looking at India, if you're looking at Brazil, it's all of the upcoming nations and all of the emerging economies that we're trying to position our place competitively in the global market. One of the major things that we also looked at in looking at architecture as a tool for social justice and for social equity is that architecture and technology are more or less, or can be synonymous with, architecture and technology is more or less the same thing. It's a tool, it's a means to achieve something. It's a means to achieve something greater. And one of those things that architecture should do is increase access to opportunities. And if you look at architecture and technology in this light, you can see that there would be much benefit in investing in the architectural future. But I think you can give some more direction on what you would specifically like to know about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to me. And of course, the fact that you're working within the context of an emergent industry and a country that has a lot of political, dynamic going on as well, a lot of contrast. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And you said that you're specifically looking into topics of computational design and ecological sustainability, as well as emerging technologies. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more how within your research you're using those aspects to explore aspects of, as you mentioned, like social and economic topics. One of the reasons for that is because obviously it's an intersection of digitalization and sociology and aspects of culture and humanitarian things as well. So I find it really interesting. And when we talk about the future and also think about the implication of such technologies in the future, what is the potential there and where we can take it within the architecture industry?
So, Sarah, as I think you make some very good associations there, which people don't generally see right away. So, if you had to break it down perhaps into three parts, the first, just if we just look at computational design, and if you look at the broad umbrella, like I've recently spoken to Timo Habo-Nielsen from Bjarke Engel's group, or he used to be, he's now at Rumble. The projects he had worked on showed the potential of computational design to take us not only into a new direction in terms of what we imagine, but that it has really practical and pragmatic uses. So, for example, one of the practical uses is to minimize the amount of time on repetitive tasks. That's something any architect can do, or architectural student, drawing windows and doors and things that are really unnecessary. So schedules and those kind of things for working drawings, really this computational design offers an insight into a world where you're not bogged down by the mundane or the repetitive or the monotonous. What it does offer as well is a new tool set for thinking, or toolkit for thinking, because when you think computationally, you're looking at more than trying to be robotic. And unfortunately, it seems to be that people have the misconception that if you go to the computer, you need to start looking at robotics and you got to look at this artificial merge between human and machine. That point may be coming in the future, but that's not what computational design is for. It's used as a tool to shape your thinking differently so that you can really engage more with the design and leave out problems or issues that would otherwise have taken you a long time to resolve. You can now leave it to a machine that is receiving a database of information to look for the most appropriate solution. So that's just on computational design. If we look at extended realities, or looking at how the fourth industrial revolution brings promise to the architectural field, what we see is that the fourth industrial revolution can really be a means of making architecture socially equitable, because technology almost instantaneously, once it's released and put into the mainstream, gives way to access. People have access to education through the internet now, online facilities, like the video that we're doing. This conversation here wouldn't have been possible without the technology, and it already makes access to places you wouldn't have gone to before. It makes it accessible. Accessible as well when it comes to economics and it comes to finances, because education to the internet can be seen as much more affordable in certain contexts than going to a university or a technical or a college, because you can receive high quality information. And if you look at the coronavirus, the pandemic, and what happened or transpired last year, I was part of a team that had been putting together an entire architectural course, which a few months ago we were looking into going online, but it wasn't a reality yet. And now over a year, we had been able to put an entire architectural curriculum online, and it's made it a lot more accessible to people, not just in our locality, but even within the greater scheme of the African continent, our African neighbors. So accessibility is one of the things that we think the fourth industrial revolution and all these other, if you can call it buzzwords, which really talks about technological accessibility, allows us. And then finally, if you look at the economic value, which I've touched on a little now, by making an architect able to compete in this world with emerging technologies and marrying perhaps man's oldest measure of progress, architecture, and man's newest measure of progress, the machine, if you can marry these two emerging fields together, then you can make the architect someone extremely valuable in society, because he has the ideas or the knowledge of the sociological, the psychological, the structural, and even within the design realms, he has the ideas of how to combine things, the philosophical approach of how to put things together, so that he can work, or he or she can work in a realm where it's virtual, where it's extended, and where it's real. And I think there's a lot of value in a person like this. So economic prospect in that sense, I think, would elevate an architect's status to what we all think it should be worth.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm really curious to ask a little bit about the transition of the full faculty or educational curriculum within the architecture online, because this is something that I'm really passionate about and I do a lot of work with. And I wanted to ask, how did it go? And, it's really just interesting to go through that process, and also like kind of see it differently, I guess, after it's been implemented. Because at the beginning, there is all this debate where people are thinking, how do we move the studio culture online, or how can we replace all this spontaneity which is happening within the class, that maybe will be taken away if everything goes online. But of course, there is an array of tools that you can use today in order to replace some of these experiences. And we think that it's a replacement, but in fact, it's a whole new method of interaction, which already is practiced every day, such as, for example, Instagram, or the way we interact on Facebook. It's a very well-accepted method of interaction, and people still can share emotions and spend hours throughout their day actually interacting in such ways. So drawing inspiration from these kind of social interactions and bringing that into the education setting of architecture, I know can work. And I wonder if, what is your point of view at that, and also some of the experience that maybe you have encountered along the way, because a lot of people that follow my platforms as well are people that have been thinking about either integrating education online, moving their faculty online, or also just architects that are teaching and looking into ways in which they can kind of execute their teaching also through online methods. So of course, it's quite a new topic in architecture, but it starts to happen more and more with big institutions definitely implementing it, and also private organizations. So going back to the question, very curious to know about the process, but also about your observations coming from more like this sort of perspective of that aspect of digitalization meeting architecture and the experience of architecture, which we know from the analog world.
So I think that's a very interesting question just in itself. And I've always thought that architecture could be something that's done online. I know that there are pros and cons, but I'll take you through the process now. So we had lockdown from March in South Africa, and the process of lockdown had prevented a lot of public institutes from continuing architectural education. I happen to fall into the private sector of education. So we had already been creating the infrastructure to deal with, we can say, such a situation. So we already had an online EMS and LMS, it's a learner management system, and EMS and education management system. We already had these facilities in place, but the difference which had occurred now was that whatever work we were doing before was done in small portions. In fact, the plan for the year before the lockdown had happened was that in small portions, we try and record our lectures. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'd have at least quarter or half of this curriculum. But when lockdown had taken effect, we had to immediately try and deal with the situation. And as an academic team, we decided that for the year, we will split ourselves among the classes. So for example, for the remainder of a quarter, I would take the entire class through all of my modules, and the same would be done with other lecturers. And moving forward from there, we would then dissipate into our respective subjects which we were supposed to have taken the classes for. So this was almost like an action plan. Turned out that a lot of changes had occurred, and I had ended up taking quite a few modules, and I had taken, in fact, the entire first year of architecture. So I think there's a lot of value in what had happened last year, particularly because I had first year architecture, and it was the first time that we were doing it online. So there's a lot of experiences that came there. So one of them, about the dynamic which you mentioned, studio culture. Studio culture was definitely something that students felt lacked, and they felt the brunt of it. But they were able to take the studio culture onto WhatsApp. And so WhatsApp became quite a dynamic spot. Students were critiquing each other, and students were having conversations about their designs all via WhatsApp. And then when they felt that they needed that sort of personal face-to-face interaction, they then went to Zoom and scheduled a Zoom meeting amongst themselves to critique each other's projects. So I feel that although there is a con to the studio culture, I think there's a con to not having a studio culture. The online presence, to some degree, almost you can say, was equivalent to it. It's obviously will never replace the physical thing. And online, I don't think the plan was to replace anything, but it definitely makes it easier to converse with somebody about high-level topics and high-level engagements when it comes to design. So for the majority of the students, it was a progressive approach, and they took well to it, especially if you look at the age group that we're looking at. We're looking at students who are between, say, 18, 19, moving up to 20, 21, 22. Round about there is the age bracket that we're looking at. And these students had loved, a lot of them had loved the system. And then there were also students who hadn't. So this is where we have to get again to the social economics of it. And students that are, of course, who have access to education and have the means could afford to be online for longer periods of time and attend the lectures. And those who couldn't, obviously, or who didn't have the resources, weren't able to. So it became, again, a matter of are you well equipped enough at home on your own to manage your classes in terms of the data? Because in South Africa, data is quite expensive. I think if you have to look at it, it's one of the highest rates in the world for it. So data is one of those things that is also that you have to take into account when you're looking at architectural education, because it does create a barrier and a separation between those who can afford it and those who can't. So those who obviously thrived online were those who could afford it, and those who didn't thrive online are those who didn't have access to data or this technology. So I'd say there are a lot of pros to it, because it's almost as if I had the students with me in front of me, and although sometimes I couldn't see their faces because they had to put it off for live streaming, they did actually get an architectural education that I would have given in class. So I'd say the only difference is you may have had my dynamics in front of the class. You would have just had me in a full body presence. But that didn't take away from the essence of what we were doing, because the ideas were communicated. And so just looking at that, we also took projects to the next level. So I am currently working on a paper which is reporting all that was done this year. One of the things was extended realities as an alternate method to architectural model representation, or that's the title of the paper. So we looked at extended realities. We looked at creating inexpensive, affordable technologies to convey architectural ideas. Generally, students will be making models, but now we allowed students to delve into the digital realm and to look at three things: virtual reality, augmented, and spatio-temporal production, or if you can call it holograms, really based on the idea of Pepper's Ghost. But it's the very famous hack that you've seen on the internet, where someone has their phone and they have this trapezoidal figure, this prism, and the light bounces off and it looks like a hologram. Now, these are all very effective, in fact, for me to get an idea of someone who was designing a project quite a distance away from me and who I couldn't see or access or touch. They would show me their projects, they would send me the files, and I would put it on my phone and be able to see, okay, in almost like a three-dimensional sense, what is going on? Or if they had sent it to me in virtual reality, and again, looking at virtual reality, so if you're looking at Revit as a software, it offers the panoramic viewing tool. So they send me files, and I could use my phone, and I would be able to look at it. And then looking at augmented reality, looking at the plug-in Aug-in, we'd used it to look at simulations of models. In fact, the entire teams were coming together and putting almost like urban design proposals through this technology. So it was highly effective in communicating something that everybody else said couldn't be done. Oh, you can never do architectural education from home. How can you do all of this? Drawing is the only way. You have to sit in front of a pen and paper. You have to feel it. And you can't take a computer into space, but you can take a pencil into space, and all these kind of associations that people make, which I think are really unnecessary, because we are just looking at alternative ways of doing things. No one is saying the pencil is going to be replaced. The pencil as an intimate tool between the designer, his ideas, and the substrate in which he's working on will always be there. No one's trying to replace that. We're just looking at perhaps more effective technologies and compressing or making these things more compatible and portable. That's all that's happening. We're just looking at alternative ways. So there's a lot of benefit coming from last year. So now we have quite a fully fledged architectural online program as a result of this. Whereas had the pandemic not occurred and we had not had the infrastructure, this may have taken another 5 years to complete this project. But now we have almost an entire year. We're now trying to fill in gaps in between and refine the process. but it really was a good experience. And I think that there's a lot of value in experiments similar to this. In fact, it wasn't really an experiment, it was a do or die situation. We had to do it.
Yeah, and it's great because that kind of situation pushed you to experiment with it, and as it sounds, it worked. So I'm curious, what potential do you see in this? Like, now you guys created this course and it's all online. Do you think that maybe, for example, the model of education within that institution can change such that, for example, more students can basically access that knowledge also from places where right now they just didn't attend from, so they had to move to the city and obviously access the education from the campus. Is that opening new possibilities, and is that also potentially a model for expansion for the institution, for the course to spread and essentially bring education maybe to people also that maybe couldn't afford to move to that place, or potentially also adult learning experience, where if you could access your classes online at any time throughout the day, why not work whilst you study? I'm just throwing hints, but I don't want to influence your answers. So,
no, I don't think these are already predetermined answers, so I don't think there's too much influencing that can happen. But my views on it remained the same, more or less the same, because I have always seen it as a tool. In fact, the questions that a lot of my colleagues and contemporaries and that we ask ourselves is, why isn't this already here? It seems like such an obvious choice to do this. And in the private sector, you see there's a lot of freedom as opposed to in the public institution, because there's a lot more processes. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with public institutes. I'm just saying that I know there's a lot more processes that would need to happen before such changes can be made. But in the private space, you have a lot more reign and a lot more freedom to conduct such experiments. So one of the things that I think is the potential of this is, firstly, reimagining curriculum. Curriculum should not be made that must just sort of use tools such as these as an adaptation. It's not an add-on. It's not a plug-in. That's not what you should do. You should reimagine the curriculum. So let's just talk about curriculum. I'll talk about it in 3 segments again. Let's just talk about curriculum. Looking at architecture curriculum, the curriculum we have now is based on decades of experience and compiling of information, where at a time we didn't have access to the technologies we have now. So for example, if you take 7 years to become an architect, you say 5 years of study and 2 years training with your board exams and all of those things, well, that seems to be generally the same thing around the world, or consistent. Yeah, generally. Why does it need to be that way? Because this was done in a time where there was no internet around. You were limited to the number of books that were around. In a particular institute, you were limited to perhaps the interactions that you had with people. Wouldn't technology sort of advance these ideas? Because we can access things almost instantaneously now about searching. We can have conversations with people around the world that couldn't have happened before in such times. Conferences can happen online. You don't have to wait so long for these things to happen. So why then should we not think about making architecture education shorter? The period should be reduced dramatically, and you can already see this if you look at Google's disruption in the higher education industry, looking at making 6-month degree courses and compressing it. I think it's very possible. I think it's almost ridiculous that we aren't rethinking the time limits in curricula. So that's one thing, because that means people can essentially get their education quicker and thereafter progress to a path that they want to specialize in life at a much shorter duration than it would have taken otherwise. So that's something that needs to be critically re-examined. I know there's a lot of sociological and biological studies to say that this is how long the mind takes to absorb information, and this is why it's a certain number of years. But if you're looking at the technology we have today, at least we should attempt to explore this avenue, that we can reduce the time it takes to become a licensed architect or a professionally registered architect. So that's one thing. The next thing that we're looking at when I talk about changing the curriculum is that these are new modes of thinking. It's not the same modes of thinking we had to approach life before. Whether you're looking at being able to learn something quicker or access information quicker, or even if you just look at the mindset people have. If architects fail to borrow from the development of the computer and its advancement in technology, and if they fail to borrow concepts like levels of abstraction and computational thinking, if they fail to borrow these things, then we are going to risk becoming obsolete while the rest of the world adopts it and moves ahead. Architecture used to be seen as a measure of one of the highest measures of progress before. And now if we refuse and we try to hold onto it being a brick and mortar structure or a physical structure, then we risk in ourselves becoming something that people will talk about only in the past and would not have moved on into the future of the times. So an entire mode of thinking needs to be developed entirely in different ways. And all of these ideas that are sitting around us, they need to be digested and thought of, and architecture education needs to be re-engineered. Now, talking about that, we're going to also now talk about modes of production or knowledge production. Before, we only had access to what was available. We spoke about the Greeks, and I always say we spoke about the Greeks, and the Romans, and we did all these civilizations. But there were many contemporaries at the time which you may not have heard of. Now that we have access to other countries and other cities and places around the world, perhaps we need to look at our curriculum and really think, well, maybe there's value in a lot of other places as well. Because whatever we've looked at in, say, in recent history, has been largely a Eurocentric view of architecture, especially if you're coming from an African continent or Indian or Brazilian. It does have a lot, and colonialism also has a lot to do with that as well. And these are quite controversial topics, but these are things topics such as decoloniality, which are being investigated. It's not very controversial. It's actually quite widely accepted in countries that have been colonized. But I know in the global conversations, there is some resistance, and then there is some advocacy for it. But really looking at it, there's modes of knowledge which have been lost, which can be now well documented through technology and embraced. Whether and I do generally have a problem with people classifying architecture that is indigenous to a place as indigenous architecture. There's so much of architecture indigenous. Architecture in Rome that belongs to the Romans can also be considered indigenous, and that to South Africans also indigenous. So why should there be a segregation? Indigenous doesn't necessarily mean tribal, or doesn't necessarily mean those people who are so-called uncivilized. We should look at different modes of knowledge and see, hey, what can we get from different nations in different places? So, and like I'm saying, I'm not saying everyone does this. I'm saying there seems to be in the architectural realm a lot of focus towards more Eurocentric view of architecture. And we need to start creating these other streams of architecture and knowledge coming in. So I see the future going into new modes of thinking, just different kinds of thinking, different philosophical, psychological, architectural approaches, as well as incorporating knowledge from a global community, as opposed to, like I say, what we've had in recent years, a more Euro-centered community, and looking at technology as shortening the gaps in which we take to educate ourselves. Because now we have the ability to research more than before. We should take full advantage of it, and we should never get stuck again in thinking that this is the way we should always do things. Rather, we should have an open mindset to say, well, this is the way we do it now, but maybe something better will come tomorrow.
Absolutely. I really agree. And I just think that, this is exactly how we advanced some things about architecture which just didn't work in the past. For example, the way we did drawing. I mean, in the past, really, not only you had to do hand drawing, but also if you made a mistake, just either start over or figure out a way in which you could erase that mistake. And it was really just so time consuming and lengthy, and in comparison to what we have today with technology, a whole other world. But in the same time, there's been always a lot of resistance within the industry. And I know this is something that we also touched on a little bit right before we did this live, where we talked a little bit about the stagnancy and resistance within the industry. And I feel that really applies to so many different aspects of technology. I remember back in the day when I was still a student, when parametric design was becoming bigger and bigger, and more people were interested in this, and there was so much resistance in the industry around that topic. I believe that still these 12, 13, 15 years later, there is still a lot of resistance about that topic, but we see already the application of parametric design in so many different ways of not only, we're not just talking about form development, we're talking also about environmental digitalization. We're talking about just ways in which you can better navigate through the city, to urban planning, and analyze even cities and mobility and things like that. So it really has incredible application in the design process. And I think that a lot of practices know it now and take it for granted. But we should also learn from the way in which we actually create that resistance to new things, because it somehow comes from just the way we are as architects. Something is there. There is something there that we just resist change. And yet we are change makers. We are always leading change. So it's really paradoxical on its own. And I honestly work with this every single day because of all the consultancy work that I do, of the research, and also publications, and talking with people like you also about this. And there's always something related to that topic, of resistance within the industry. And I find it really interesting. But also in a way, I would love to see more change. And so when we talk about this kind of aspect of slow to change, with every single new technology, we find that resistance. And I feel that that there is definitely thing like that happening a little bit around digital education, moving online, learning online, potentially shortening the path, which is such a new topic, and so it's so new almost that it's almost scary to roll it out of the tongue, to talk about shortening the path of an architect because of digitalization. But that is the future, and it could be the future. It could be the future. And if so, then I guess we should think about what if, So
that's true.
I know that you do a lot of work related to that, what if, and I'm curious about that, to ask you a little bit about your research, and also, this project that you have, the architecture of the future, and how that relates to the topics that we're just talking about.
So currently, one of the things that I think brought a lot of this slow to change ideas to motion for the rest of the world to really see is also slow to change in a social sense. If we looked at Black Lives Matter, and we looked at, in South Africa, we had Fees Must Fall, you begin to see that there's still a lot of social inequity and social injustices that occur. And when you do look at this, and you do look at this sort of social movement, you think about people looking at a social sustainability. And if you're looking at a social sustainability, I think that would be the first key towards environmental sustainability, because everybody mentions environmental sustainability. It's quite a hot topic. In fact, whilst I was studying, it was already 10 years into its development. Well, actually, in our curriculum, meaning it was already about 10 years old in our curriculum, this idea of sustainability. But sustainability, environmental sustainability, is something human beings, I would say, almost inherently know, or at least in your realm of society, that you shouldn't waste. You should not be opulent, you should not be extravagant, you should be prudent, and you should be looking, have an accountable set that we share in this abundance in the world. But we know that this abundance, if we can share it equally, I know it sounds a bit paradoxical, but if we can share resources equally, we would get sharing of resources that allows for us to all prosper. So when we're looking at all of these things that have been highlighted, you begin to realize that there aren't that many people talking about it, and why aren't they talking about it? And so one of the things within the project, The Future of Architecture, is why aren't there these conversations about architecture in the mainstream? Because there are, but you have to look really hard to find it, seemingly. You'll find people that talk about it, you'll find many blogs on it, and there's many, and I don't really can get them off the top of my head now, but there are many people, but it's just so hidden. So one of the aims of The Future of Architecture, of the project that I'm doing with a number of esteemed architectural professionals, is trying to bring these conversations to the fore, not for the sake of propaganda, but for the sake of saying, you know what, if we don't talk about these things, perhaps it's going to overtake us and we are not going to benefit from it. and it may actually be of detriment to us. So the first thing I'd say is having conversations about things that would seemingly be difficult or maybe challenging to talk about and where there's no actual defined answer. That's the first thing. The second thing is students. In being a lecturer and in being a student myself at some stage, well, like in life, you would be always a student. But as being a lecturer, I do see that students are getting into a field, and it's almost as if the future doesn't look very bright. It looks somewhat bleak at this moment in time, the way that we think it is. If you continue architectural education as the way it was done, say generally about 10, 20 years ago, I don't think we're going to actually progress in this field. We aren't going to make architecture or push its boundaries or develop it to such a level that it develops with the same pace that humankind or mankind is developing. It's actually just, it's not going to get there if we keep the same attitudes we fostered a few decades ago. So the students need to be aware of that. They need to be aware that you're getting into a field, and the field is, which is, and if you just look at it, Gen people, the earliest interest students have in architecture is, I like buildings, I like to draw, or this looks interesting. I want to, maybe if someone's a little bit more well-read, they might say, I want to create a nice space. But you've got to understand architecture is not just about that, and that architecture is a tool to resolve many problems simultaneously or at the appropriate time. So students need to become aware of critically engaging with architecture. So a lot of the research I've been doing in the last 5 years at the organization that I run called An Architect was focused on what is architecture actually, and what if we can define then what architecture is and shape it as we go. And architecture not just being functional and being shelter and being any of the things that we have ever thought it was before. If we think of it as something else now, something else entirely, or at least as a combination of the things we've thought it was before, then we can redefine or at least reintroduce the field as something different that can actually facilitate our lives now, and not something that is seen as only for the elite or the privileged or those who can afford it, or something that's extravagant and unnecessary. It must actually become, because as architects, we all know what the value of architecture, but people don't generally seem to have that perception. And I honestly, in my opinion, think this came when architecture and engineering had that split between themselves, where architecture became more arts focused and engineering became more science focused. I think through, as I discussed in one of the talks of the future of architecture with Timo, bringing it together through computational design and new modes of thinking, because then architecture would have a value again, or at least a perceived value. It's not that there's no value, it's just people don't perceive its value, especially if you can design your own home on an app that can give you guidance, or in virtual reality design something, then you really don't see a need for an architect anymore, or even an architectural engineer or a structural engineer, because if you can sort of do these things on your own through technology, why would you need them? So I think architects need to reinvent. So that's one of the things students must think about, what is architecture? In fact, this was a question that I actually grappled with a lot whilst I was studying, particularly in my second year. I had asked a question, or a lecturer had asked me, what is architecture to you? And because at the moment in time, I felt like it was such a confusing thing to define, I had embarked on a journey to actually rethink this, or to actually create a definition for myself. In doing so, about 3, 4, I think 5 years later, I had finished a draft of a book which I called What is Architecture, as its same name, Understanding Architecture, which you could see as a summary of my degree in architecture. It was a summary of the most insightful things I found that I didn't have prior to me studying at university. So I try to get the students to do the same thing and really use these insights which I've gathered to guide them in direction towards forming architecture, a definition for themselves, because the book that I've written creates a base definition for architecture, but it doesn't incorporate everything. Students then need to figure out, well, maybe what he's talking is nonsense. Architecture is not that at all. This is what I think architecture is. I think if at a very early stage you can define what architecture is to you and see how it develops over time, you can look to reinventing the field, or at least appropriating it to your situation, to your circumstances, whether it's local or national or even global. And then also with the future of architecture talks, one of the things that lacks is information on it for research. You have to really be specialized and know who you talk, or at least in the circles that I'm coming from, know where to go to find it. my aim is to try and make this publicly accessible, because at my organization, one of the main things, one of the main pillars that we focus on is accessibility to information. So all of these recordings will be made freely available online, and the citations and a lot of the research that the guests have been doing will also be made available freely. So for example, citations and references and places to go where you can get this knowledge from, so that we can really take this conversation forward. It's not for the elitist of the architects to do, nor is it for only those who have the privilege of getting an education from a top-tier university. In fact, it should be a conversation we all are contributing to, because we all have an equal stake in this field called architecture. So yes, I think that maybe in part summarizes the future of architecture project that I'm working on, or one of the many projects, but that at least this is the main focus of it.
So fascinating. I mean, I love it because it's very aligned with some of the research that I'm doing and some of the work that I'm doing, and aligned with the belief sort of system which is driving my work forward as well. So I love where you're taking it, and I'm wishing you all the best. If in any way my platform can serve as a, exposure or a reach also to other people, then you're always welcome. And thank you so much for joining me today. Is there anywhere specific that you would like people to go to check more information about your work and your research?
So, Sarah, I must thank you first before I do get into it. Thank you very much for hosting me. It's been a pleasure. I actually haven't been had a discussion to this extent on the work that I've been doing, so I must thank you for that. And more conversations like this do need to happen, undoubtedly across the board. So thank you very much for offering me this opportunity to be on your platform. The research that I'm doing, you can find it if you have to search on Facebook, because it's a Facebook page which I run, which the organization runs. It's called at an architect South Africa. If you search it on Google, it will come up. If you search it on Facebook, it will come up. And we also have a LinkedIn page which also offers the same information, and there's also a site on it as well. But all of the information can be found on the Facebook page, because that's really the mainstream of communication, which I'm trying to drive a lot of this change and display a lot of the work that I'm doing.
Excellent. Akheel, thank you so very much for this. It was really extremely interesting, and I'm really looking forward to some of your publications, and I'm personally going to be reading those, so let me know. And you also wrote one book that you mentioned before.
Yes.
Is there a way people can purchase it anywhere?
Yes, so it can be purchased via Go Architect, but it can also be purchased via the same Facebook site I've mentioned. So Go Architect, the independent media organization and publisher, they published it, so the physical one can be purchased through them. And if you also go via my site, as an architect South Africa, you can also purchase the book through there.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your time. I'm looking forward to chatting to you again in future. Thank you. Exactly. You as well.
Yeah, keep going with your research, and I'm looking forward to more revelations on this front. And yeah, thank you for your work as well. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Same here, Sarah. Take care of yourself. Bye.
Likewise. Bye. Thank you.